السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. طلابنا الأعزاء، طلاب الفرقة الأولى شعبة اللغة الإنجليزية كلية تجارة جامعة المنوفية، في الكورس بتاعنا ل Quantitative Analysis. Actually, we start already introducing the first part in the Quantitative Analysis course. We introduced the summation notation and how to use it to calculate mean, variance, standard deviation, and also we use that to introduce the correlation and regression analysis. يبقى أول جزء أخدناه في مادة الدراسات الكمية، عرضنا فيه علامة المجموع وإزاي نطبقها في حساب بعض الكميات المعينة، وعملنا ابلكيشن على إزاي نحسب المين والفاريانس والستاندرد ديفيشن، وفي نفس الوقت قدمنا فكرة الكورليشن والريجريشن to study relation between two quantitative variables. هنبدأ النهاردة السكند بارت in somehow introducing a linear programming. I said before, business analytics can be classified as descriptive analytics, predictive analytics, and prescriptive analytics. يبقى تحليلات الأعمال، لو جاز التعبير وترجمنا كلمة business analytics بمعنى تحليلات الأعمال، قلنا بنقسم تحليلات الأعمال إلى 3 types. الفيرست تايب بنسميه descriptive analytics, just describe the data that you have. ومن انواع الديسكريبتيف اناليتكس هو المين والفاريانس والستاندرد ديفيشن، بنسميها descriptive measures to describe what you have. السكند تايب اللي هو اسمه predictive analytics, you need to use some models to predict future values or predict the unknown values. ده in somehow النوع ده بيسميه التحليلات التنبؤية. التحليلات التنبؤية يعني أكثر نوع منها اللي هو السمبل دايركت ابلكيشن عليها هو الكورليشن اند ريجريشن اناليسيس and mainly regression analysis. الثيرد تايب بنسميه البريسكريبتيف اناليتكس، تقدر تقول تحليلات نحو الأمثلية أو الأفضلية، إنك you need to decide the best, you need to make the best decision. You have some choices and you need to select the best choice. You need to maximize profit, you need to minimize the cost, and you have some constraints, and based on these constraints you need to make the best decision. يبقى النوع الثالث من التحليلات بنسميه البريسكريبتيف اناليتكس، بالعربي ممكن نترجمه تحليلات نحو الأفضلية أو الأمثلية in somehow. دي ترجمة غير حرفية ولكن تاخد المعنى الإجمالي. يبقى البيزنس اناليتكس لو رجعنا لأول محاضرة، يبقى أنواع البيزنس اناليتكس 3: descriptive analytics, mean and standard deviation; predictive analytics, regression analysis; prescriptive analytics, that linear programming. يبقى linear programming one of the methods that we can use it to introduce the prescriptive analytics. Linear programming I will introduce a general idea, لكن mainly linear programming means you need to formulate the problem in the mathematical way and solve them. That a general introduction about linear programming. Programming mainly كلمة programming معناها كده صياغة المشكلات في صورة رياضية لحل هذه المشكلات. يبقى you are actually formulating problems in some mathematical ways or models, and then you need to solve them to make the best decision, to have an optimal solution. The optimal solution can be maximize the profit or minimize the cost. Okay, to introduce that هيبقى عندنا في 4 points. The first point, introduction to linear programming. هناخد general introduction, the meanings and what is the meaning of the linear programming, some characteristics, elements of the linear programming, and then how to formulate linear programming in the mathematical way, in the linear programming structure. If you have some problems in words and then you need to formulate them in the linear programming structure. هناخد حاجة اسمها صياغة المشكلات في صورة البرمجة الخطية. The second point, how to solve linear programming problems graphically. يبقى how to use the graphs to solve linear programming. That's one of the main objectives. يبقى the first 2 points I have to cover. Then for the last 2 points I will see about time. If you have time, then we can add how to solve linear programming problems using simplex method, and how to find a dual problem for the linear programming problems, and then how to solve them. يبقى هنعمل covering the first 2 points, and then according to time I will see how I can cover the last 2 points. يبقى linear programming هم الأربع نقاط دول. الجزء الأولاني theoretical part, definitions والformulation. Second part, how to solve graphically. Third and last, that how to solve using a simplex method and find a dual problem. هنشوف مع بعض how I can actually plot that. نبدأ الجزء definitions. We have some terminology and definitions. الحقيقة موجودين في السلايدز دي، هنزلها لكم حالا. الجزء اللي هو النوتس دي لكن هنشوف الايه السمري using الباوربوينت for these points and then we can start the formulation. يبقى هنبدأ من أول الفلير Furniture Company. That one of the applications how to formulate the problems in the linear programming structure. لكن قبل كده في شوية يعني definitions and terminology and characteristics for the linear programming I have to introduce. Okay, so for the linear programming in general, as I said, that one of the methods in the prescriptive analytics. So in general, in that chapter outline, I need to have introduction, the requirements for the linear programming, how to formulate linear programming and the graphical solution, and these the first 2 points, as I told you, we need to cover in the linear programming part. Okay, so in general, actually, in the for the management decisions, you need to make most effective use of the limited resources. You have limited resources. You need to actually have the most effective use of these limited resources. From that point, we'll find the problems. You need to formulate them in the structure of you have objective function and you have some constraints. So from that, you have a linear programming. Formulating problems in the mathematical way. Mostly all the relations are in the linear form. Most of the relations in the linear form, linear equations, linear inequality. From that you have actually the word linear. يبقى linear, formulating all the relations in the linear form. Linear equations, linear inequalities, all that in the linear form. يبقى programming means modeling and solving a problem mathematically. And linear means you are formulating all the relations in the linear form. From that, you can put the requirements for the linear programming problem. By linear programming problems, we have 4 characteristics mainly. First, you need to maximize or minimize a specific quantity. We name that an objective function. But to maximize or minimize, you have some restrictions or limitations or constraints. These constraints based on the problem under study. And then you have linear equations or inequalities, and you have alternative actions you can actually select from them. Based on that, I can introduce the elements of the linear programming. So linear programming, I will tell you now based on the real application, what I mean by that. So the main elements for the linear programming, you have 4 elements. First, decision variables. Second, objective function based on the decision variables or a function of the decision variables, and then structural constraints, and then non-negative constraints. I will give you a brief definition for these 4 elements, but I will return back for this point. يبقى البرمجة الخطية الحقيقة ليها 4 elements، 4 عناصر مهمين. نقدر نقول عليهم definitions أو elements according to that. أول element بنسميه decision variables، بالعربي المتغيرات القرارية. يعني the unknown variables that you need to decide their values to have the optimal solution or to make the most effective or to make the best decision. Okay, so these variables mostly it will be unknowns, and from that you have the linear programming problem. I will tell you how I can find that from the real applications and how we can decide we have how many decision variables we have. So decision variables بالعربي متغيرات قرارية هي متغيرات مجهولة القيمة يراد اتخاذ قرار حيال قيمها للوصول إلى الحل الأمثل. الoptimal solution can be ممكن يكون يعني maximizing the profit أو minimizing the cost أو minimizing the time if you have a transportation problem for example. الobjective function mainly الobjective معناه هنا الهدف. الهدفك إيه؟ إنك تعمل maximize the profit أو minimize the cost. طب why we are saying objective function? Because the objective function is a function of the decision variables. يبقى دايما الobjective سواء كان تعظيم ربح أو تقليل تكلفة أو تقليل وقت بيكون دالة في المتغيرات القرارية. I will see how I can put that in the mathematical form. The structure constraints means the restrictions or the limitations or the constraints you are getting from the problem under study. بالعربي بنسميها القيود الهيكلية. كلمة structure ده معنى هيكل، يعني هيكل المشكلة. يبقى structural constraints يعني القيود الهيكلية من المشكلة محل الدراسة. non-negative constraints بنسميها القيود عدم السلبية. يبقى decision variables you need to decide their values to maximize or to have an optimal solution, maximize the profit or minimize cost, or you need to have an optimal solution or optimal value for the objective function. An objective function is a function of the decision variable that you need to get the optimal value for that function. Structural constraints, the restrictions or the constraints or the limitations that you have from the problem under study. This is why we name that structural constraints. In non-negative constraints, some constraints we are adding from our side to guarantee you have realistic solution, and mainly to guarantee you have non-negative values for the decision variables. Mostly in our applications we need decision variables non-negative values. We need the values of the decision variables are non-negative, then we are adding non-negative constraints. All these 4 elements actually I will explain that using one application. هنشوف مع بعض مثال application على problem هنعملها formulation وهنطلع ال 4 elements. يبقى first, how to formulate linear programming. You have to start with the decision variables, then find the objective function and the constraints, and then formulate them in the form that I will tell you later about the linear programming structure. Okay, so based on that you can put some assumptions for the linear programming. You have only one objective function to be able to maximize or minimize. You have some constraints, structural constraints, and the non-negative constraints. So you have one or more constraints. You have some actions, alternative courses of action. That means you have the possibility to have more than one action, means in deciding the values of the variables that you need. That can be the way that you are deciding actually. The objective function and the constraints are linear. From that you have the word linear programming, LP, that stands for linear programming. So linear, why? Because all the relations that you have, the objective function, the structural constraints, and the non-negative constraints, all of them actually are linear relations. Even equations, or you have inequalities, then you have linear form for these formulations of the relations between the objects that you have. Last point, non-negative variables. As I told you, non-negative variables means you have non-negative values for the decision variables that you have. So that mostly the characteristics of the, you can say, properties or assumptions for the linear programming. Okay, so how to formulate linear programming? Mostly, first you have to develop the mathematical model to represent any managerial problem. You have to formulate that in the linear programming. It can be linear or non-linear, but in our course only I'm discussing how to formulate a linear programming, a linear form for all the relations. So I have some steps that just to be a guide for you. First, try to completely understand the problem that you have. Second, try to define the decision variables. Based on the decision variables, you can identify the objective function and the constraints, and then you can start to write that in the mathematical form. You have objective function, and then subject to, and put structural constraints, and then non-negative constraints. يبقى أي مسألة عايز تعملها formulation محتاج في الأول يعني تقرأ المسألة كويس جدا، تفهمها أيا كانت المشكلة الإدارية اللي عندك، البروبلم that you need to solve. You have to first formulate. يبقى أي مشكلة linear programming, before solving that you have to formulate. يبقى first you have to formulate linear programming before solving. How to formulate the steps بتاعتنا. First, you read that carefully. Second, define the decision variables. بتحدد المتغيرات القرارية من المسألة بتاعتك. Third, بتحدد الاوبجكتيف فانكشن والكونسترينتس. بتشوف مين الاوبجكتيف عندك وتكتبها في شكل فانكشن طبعا، وبعدين بتشوف الكونسترينتس او الليميتيشنز او ريستريكشنز اللي عندك. بتحدد الاوبجكتيف and الكونسترينتس. Once you have that done, you have the decision variables and you have an objective function and constraints. Step 4, you can formulate that or write that in the mathematical form. Write objective function and then write constraints. By the constraints I mean the structural constraints and the non-negative constraints. Okay? لما اقول كلمة constraints يعني تحوي الاثنين، تحوي the structural constraints وتحوي non-negative constraints. اوكي، هنبدأ مع بعض ناخد مثال. طبعا most of the problems can be transportation problem or production problem, but most of our applications it will be about the production problem, even maximize the profit or minimize the cost. اغلب المشكلات اللي هنتكلم عنها في الكورس بتاعنا هتكون على maximize the profit او minimize the cost، فغالبا هي production problems. لكن we have many the problems can be formulating in the linear programming structure. A transportation problem مشكلة النقل can be a production problem مشكلة الإنتاج, and you have other actually problems can be formulated in that way. Okay, we can start now with one example about the formulation. هبدأ معاكم بمثال على الفورمulation. Please now we need to read that carefully and then we can formulate. You'll find that in the lecture notes. في lecture notes بتاعتنا هتلاقيها موجود، لكن I'm putting that in the word file to be clear for you how to read that. Okay, that's our example. So that is actually production problem. It's given for you about the Flair Furniture Company produces inexpensive tables and chairs, and you have the production process for each is similar in that both require a certain number of hours of carpentry work and a certain number of labor hours in the painting and vernishing department. يبقى هنا المشكلة مشكلة إنتاج. بيقول لي إيه؟ بيقول لي في كومباني اسمها فلير فرنتشر كومباني، يعني شركة أثاث بتنتج نوعين، بتنتج تيبلز اللي هو الايه الترابيزات او الطاولات يعني، والتشيرز اللي هي الكراسي. اوكي طيب، وبعدين البرودكشن بروسيس هنا بتمر بمرحلتين، مرحله النجاره الكاربنتري، والسكند اللي هي البينتنج اند فيرنيشنج. طيب هيبدا يديك هنا الكوست او in somehow الhours of the carpentry and painting for each table and each product. يبقى الاول هتكلم على التيبل. each table takes 4 hours of carpentry and 2 hours in the painting and vernishing. Each chair requires 3 hours in carpentry and 1 hour in painting and vernishing. During the current production period, you have 240 hours of carpentry time are available, and then 100 hours in painting and vernishing are available. Each table sold yields a profit of $70. Each chair produced is sold for a $50 profit. The question, last point, how many tables and chairs can be produced to maximize the profit? That problem now is a production problem. You'll find all the introduction that we actually introduced is now you can find all that in that problem. You can find the 4 elements from that problem. You can find the decision variables. We can find the objective. We can find the structure constraints, and we can add from our side the non-negative constraints. يعني المشكلة قدامك مشكلة إنتاج. لما تقراها كويس قوي الخلاصة بتاعتها بالعربي إنه بيقول لك بينتج حاجتين، كراسي، ترابيزات وكراسي، والإنتاج بيتم على مرحلتين، مرحلة النجارة ومرحلة الدهانات والفينيشنج الأخير. خلاص كده؟ هيبدأ يتكلم على كل تيبل إنها بتحتاج ساعات عمل 4 ساعات نجارة وساعتين للدهانات، وكل تشير بيحتاج 3 ساعات للنجارة وساعة للدهانات. وبيديك هنا الليميتيشنز او ريستريكشنز على المشكله دي اللي بيسموها هنا ده كده الستراكشر كونستراينتس. الكونستراينتس بتاعتنا انه الافيلابل تايم للكاربنتري مش هيزيد عن 240. كلمه افيلابل يعني ده الماكسيمم افيلابل تايم، وال 100 اورز هنا الماكسيمم افيلابل تايم للبينتنج عباره عن 100 ساعه عمل. دول الحقيقه التو بوينتس اللي هم دول الليميتيشنز، دول الكونستراينتس. طيب وبعدين بيديك البروفيت. يبقى لو حبينا ناخد الفور elements بالترتيب، لو انا رجعت تاني للسلايد بتاعي اللي هو فيه الفور elements، دول الفور elements اللي هم الديسيجن variables، الاوبجكتيف فانكشن، الستراكشر كونستراينتس، النون نيجاتيف كونستراينتس، ودي الستبس اللي المفروض انا ابدا اعمل بيها فورميليشن. لو رجعنا تاني للمثال البسيط ده هنبدا نسال سؤال بسيط جدا. فين هنا in that question what are the decision variables؟ ايه هي المتغيرات القراريه؟ السكند question what are the objective؟ الثيرد what are the constraints؟ last non-negative constraints. يبقى الobject first decision variables هنا the unknown variables that you need to decide their values to maximize the objective function. يبقى عندي decision variables هنا بالنسبة لي هو number of tables and number of chairs. يبقى لو حبيت اعمل formulation اول point اللي هي decision variables اللي هم بالنسبة لي هنا number of tables and number of chairs. ممكن احط ده كنوتيشنز، ممكن نسمي T و C whatever. يبقى اول point هنا فين decision variables number of tables and number of chairs. Second question what is the objective in that problem? The objective maximizing the profit. Third question what are the constraints or the restrictions in that problem? The restrictions that available time for the carpentry equal 240 hours and available time for the painting and vernishing it's 100 hours. Okay, then based on these informations now I can formulate the linear programming. In linear programming structure you have first the objective as a function of the decision variables, and then write the structural constraints, and then write the non-negative constraints at the end. So now, based on that, I need to add these points. So please, we can think about how to formulate. Okay, so now I need to start to formulate that. So first steps, step 1, after understanding, finding the decision variables, finding the objective function constraints, then I need to write the structure. So first, starting in the structure, I will write first the names of the decision variables. So now, a number of tables and a number of chairs, I will name that a number of tables as T, with number of chairs as C. Even now, first point before putting the objective function, I will put notations for the decision variables. So now the decision variable is now T and C. So T means the number of tables that you have to produce to maximize the objective function, or to find the optimal value for the objective function. Maximize optimal value means maximize the profit or minimize the cost. Second is C, the number of chairs. يبقى T and C, that decision variables now, that the first step. Second step, you have to write the objective function as a function of the decision variables. يبقى أول step حددنا المتغيرات القرارية في المسألة بتاعتنا هم العدد التيبلز وعدد التشيرز. يبقى عندي كام متغير قراري في المسألة هنا؟ How many decision variables? Only 2. T and C, the number of tables and the number of chairs. طيب الأوبجيكتيف فانكشن قلنا maximize البروفيت. السؤال بقى ده الأوبجيكتيف maximize البروفيت. Objective function means write an objective as a function of T and C, as a function of the decision variables. يبقى هنكتب الأوبجيكتيف الهدف على إنه دالة في المتغيرات القرارية. السؤال بتاعي من المعلومات اللي عندنا هنا، هل نقدر نكتب البروفيت كدالة في التي والسي؟ الأنسر yes. Why? Read from that point you have an information of the profit for each table and each share. So each table sold yields a profit of $70. يبقى for each one value of the tables we have 70, and for each one value of the share we have $50. So what is the total profit now? So for each table you have $70 as a profit, then the total profit for the tables it will be 70T. يبقى second point now, I'm writing an objective function, our objective as a function of the decision variable. So 70T, that giving you a total profit for all the tables that you will produce, plus, or before adding a plus, what is the total profit for all the chairs? It will be 50C. So now total profit, it will be 70T plus 50C, and now you can name that as profit or just P, whatever notation. So now the profit, or the P in our case, sorry. So now I write that as P, which means the profit, now equal 70T plus 50C, and our objective maximize, so just you can write before that as max or maximize. So that's the objective function, the objective as a function of the decision variable. So maximize the profit that equals 70T plus 50C. Now we finalize the second point. The third point, I need to find the structural constraints. How many constraints we have in that problem? We have 2 decision variables. We have 1 objective function all the time. It's 1 objective function. But for the structural constraints, you can have more than one or more than one structural constraints. So now in our problem, how many? That's the question. How many structural constraints we have? We have 2. One constraint about the hours of carpentry, and a second constraint about the hours of the painting and vernishing. So now I can write now the structural constraints as 2 constraints. The first one, as a note for you, for carpentry. Okay, that will be the constraint for the carpentry. The second constraint will be for the painting and vernishing. Okay, just a note. So now I need to write the structural constraints first for the carpentry. The carpentry, the available time, all the available time, 240. So write that. And the available time for the painting is 100. Now the question, based on the information that you have, for each table, you need 4 hours of the carpentry. So now all the tables requires 40 hours for the carpentry, and each chair requires 3 hours of the carpentry. So now all the chairs requires 3C of the carpentry. يعني كل التيبلز هتحتاج 40 من الساعات العمل في النجارة، وكل التشيرز هتحتاج 3C من ساعات العمل في النجارة. The sum of these two values has to be not more than 240. يعني 40 plus 3C, the total hours of the carpentry for the tables and the chairs, that has to be not more than 240. In mathematics, how to write not more than? Not more than means less than or equal. That the first constraint. That the first structural constraint. يبقى أول قيد بتاع النجارة بنقرا المسألة كويس قوي ونطلع ساعات النجارة لكل تيبل وساعات النجارة لكل تشير ونحط النوتيشنز. لاحظ إنه الأوبجكتيف فانكشن هي دالة في الديسيجن فاريبلز، والكونسترينتس دالة في الستراكشر دالة في الديسيجن فاريبلز. يعني كل الصياغات بتعتمد على الديسيجن فاريبلز. عشان كده أهم بوينت في الأول إنك تحدد المتغيرات القرارية وتديها رموز وتلتزم بالرموز دي في كل المسألة. طيب كده طلعنا الستراكشر كونسترين بتاع الكاربنتري. In the same way we can find for the, we had that for the carpentry, that for the carpentry. Now we need to find for the painting. So for each table you have 2 hours for the painting. يبقى all the hours 2T plus for the that for the painting for the tables, and then painting for the chairs only 1 hour, so you have 1C. You can write C, but to confirm the value I will write 1C, but you can write that as just C. So 2T plus 1C, that is total hours available for the painting and vernishing. That has to be not more than that the total hours, the total number of hours required for the painting and vernishing for tables and chairs, that has to be not more than 100. In mathematics not more than means less than or equal. يبقى عندك إجمالي ساعات الدهانات والفينش النهائي للتيبلز والتشيرز هو عبارة عن 2T plus 1C. ده المفروض ما يزيدش عن 100، يبقى أقل من أو يساوي. ده كده السكند structural constraints. يبقى first كتبنا الأوبجكتيف فانكشن. ده الأوبجكتيف فانكشن maximize ال P equal 70T plus 50C. بعدين بتكتب subject to. subject to معناها إنه subject to the constraints. يعني ان الاوبجكتيف فانكشن دي محدوده ب او مشروطه ب بعض الكونسترينتس اللي احنا هنكتبها مع بعض. subject to the constraints او just subject to، وبعدين تكتب الكونسترينتس الستراكشر constraints. هنا السؤال we have 2 decision variables, we have 1 objective function, we have 2 structure constraints. Do you have any other information remaining in the problem now not included in the structure? Answer no. كل المعلومات اللي في المسألة كده موجودة عندي في الصياغة دي. عندي دالة شكل معادلة، وبعدين عندي subject to، وعندي متباينات اللي هي الانيكواليتيز بتعبر عن الستراكشر كونسترينتس. اخر بوينت كده احنا عملنا 1 و2 و3. اخر بوينت بنسميها non negative constraints. non negative constraints يعني ايه؟ انت وبتحل المساله، اوكي، انت بتحل المساله هل ينفع تلقى قيمه التي والسي بالنيجاتيف؟ يعني عدد التيبلز بيساوي مثلا negative 5 والنمبر اوف تشيرز equal negative 3. الانسر no. has to be non-negative. Can be 0, yes, but has to be non-negative values. Then I have to add from my side a non-negative constraint saying that in T, that a decision variable has to be less than or equal, has to be greater than or equal 0, and C has to be greater than or equal 0. And these two constraints, now I have 2 constraints. These 2 constraints actually we name them a non-negative constraints, and that the fourth element in the linear programming. يبقى linear programming في 4 definitions أخدناهم اللي هم decision variables, objective function, structure constraints, non-negative constraints. They are the elements of the linear programming structure. يعني عشان تصيغ أي مشكلة في شكل البرمجة الخطية محتاج الأول بتحدد decision variables, then find the objective function and the constraints, and then write the objective function and write the structure constraints, and you add the constraints. Some questions, if I ask you general questions, how many decision variables we have in that problem? The answer 2. كم متغير قراري في المسألة دي؟ 2. how many objective function we have in that problem 1 ودايما هيبقى 1 objective function. That one of the characteristics of the linear programming structure. Third, how many structural constraints we have? 2. One for the carpentry, second for the painting. Fourth, how many non-negative constraints we have? 2. One constraint for T, second constraint for C. Last question, how many constraints we have? لو قلت how many constraints بغير ما احدد structure or non-negative, you can say 4. Why 4? لأن عندي 2 structural constraints و 2 non-negative constraints, يبقى we have 4 structural constraints. Okay, you'll find that actually in the lecture notes. هنشوف مع بعض lecture notes، هتلقى الكلام ده موجود فيها. هنعمل clear all that we don't need it. اوكي، ده المساله في الليكتشر نوتس. بعدين بيبدا يتكلم ماكسمايز البروفيت، يديك بقى نوتيشنز، يبدا بالاول بالديسيجن فاريبلز، يطلع الاوبجكتيف فانكشن، يحط الكونسترينتس، وبعدين يديك في الاخر خالص الصياغه العامه، ودي الصياغه بتاعتنا. ماكسمايز البروفيت subject to and adding the 4 constraints, 2 constraints, the structural constraints and 2 non-negative constraints. So writing a non-negative constraints in different ways actually can be. يعني ممكن تكتب ال non-negative constraints في أكثر من شكل، لكن لو ال questions MCQ question then you are just selecting what you have from the choice in that case. ممكن تبقى الأسئلة في شكل MCQ questions وهنشوف ده. ده معنى how to formulate linear problems. هتلاقوا في محاضرات تانية إن شاء الله هكمل لكم. هنتكلم على once that the first step. يبقى ال first step you have to formulate the problem in the linear programming structure. Once you formulate you can start to solve that. How to solve? You have 2 ways. First, solving that graphically. يبقى الحل الأول ممكن حل بياني. Second, you can solve that using a simplex method that in the way we can introduce it. هنشوف ده. يبقى في حل عندي بياني وفي حل جبري باستخدام السمبلكس ميثود. في الليكشر نوتس بدأ لغاية الجرافيكال سوليوشن. الحقيقة هنسجل فيديو تاني على الجرافيكال سوليوشن، لكن دي المحاضرة اللي فيها الجزء النظري وفيها الجزء الايه الفورميليشن. يبقى definitions, okay, and how to formulate, and then once you formulate you'll find that the final form that we have as I told you. Okay, so now we finalize that. We can start inshallah from next lecture how to solve that, how to solve a linear programming graphically or using the graph to solve a linear programming. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.